The art of not turning into an ice cube. Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, I want you to just settle in. Maybe dim the lights. Find that one spot on the pillow that actually feels right for once, and let's just let the world outside go quiet. We're going to take a long, slow walk through some drafty corridors. We're heading back to the Middle Ages, specifically into the bedrooms of the people who supposedly had it all, but who spent about 4 months of the year essentially living in a very expensive, very decorative stone freezer. We like to romanticize castles, don't we? We think of tapestries and grand feasts, but if you were actually there, standing in the middle of a great hall in January, your main personality trait would just be shivering. Because let's be honest, building a massive house out of solid rock in Northern Europe wasn't exactly a masterclass in insulation. It was a choice made by people who prioritized not being hit by a catapult over being able to feel their toes. And tonight, we're going to look at exactly how they managed to sleep without waking up as a human popsicle. Because, spoilers, it involved a lot of furs, a lot of strangers, and a surprising amount of alcohol. So, let's start with the walls. If you've ever touched a stone bridge or a cathedral wall in the winter, you know that stone doesn't just get cold, it holds the cold. It hoards it. It's like the stone is personally offended by the concept of warmth. In a medieval castle, those walls could be 10, 12, sometimes 20 feet thick. Great for stopping a battering ram, sure. Not so great for your circulation. The heat from a fireplace would hit those stones and just vanish. It was like trying to heat a cave with a single candle. And then there were the windows, or as they were known back then, the holes where the wind lives. Glass was an absolute flex. If you had glass, you were basically the Elon Musk of the 1300s. Most people just had wooden shutters, or maybe some translucent animal bladder stretched over a frame, which is exactly as gross and ineffective as it sounds. You'd be lying there, listening to the wind whistle through a literal piece of a cow's internal organs, wondering why you ever decided to be a duke in the first place. But the elites, our beloved, slightly too related royals, had a few tricks. The first line of defense wasn't the fire. It was the room within a room. You see, they didn't just sleep in a bed, they slept in a wooden fortress. The four-poster bed wasn't just for looking fancy, though of course it was definitely for that too. It was a functional piece of climate control. Imagine a massive wooden frame with heavy, thick wool curtains hanging on all four sides. When you climbed in and pulled those curtains shut, you were creating a tiny, humid microclimate powered entirely by your own breath and body heat. It was basically a luxury tent made of sheep hair. Inside those curtains, it might be a balmy 60 degrees, while 3 feet away, on the other side of the velvet, there was literal frost forming on the floorboards. And who was inside that bed with you? Well, if you were a king or a high-ranking noble, you probably weren't alone. And I don't just mean your spouse. Privacy is a very modern, very spoiled invention. In the medieval mind, being alone was actually kind of suspicious. If you were alone, you were probably plotting something, or worse, being depressed, which they didn't really have a word for yet beyond having too much black bile. So, you'd have your body servants, your pages, maybe a couple of favorite knights. They wouldn't all be in the bed, usually, but they'd be right there on the floor. Pallets, they called them, basically medieval sleeping bags. A whole room full of snoring, breathing, slightly unwashed humans. Because why use a space heater when you can just use the collective metabolic output of 4 teenage boys named peers? It was cozy. In a we all share the same air and probably the same lice kind of way. Speaking of lice, let's talk about the bedding. You didn't just have a duvet, you had layers. You had a straw mattress on the bottom, which was basically a giant tea bag for sweat and bugs. On top of that, if you were fancy, you had a feather bed. This was the peak of comfort. But feathers are excellent insulators for birds, and they work just as well for humans. You'd sink into this cloud of goose down, and then they'd pile on the furs. We're talking wolf, fox, sable, bear. If it had a pulse and a coat, a medieval royal would turn it into a blanket. It was heavy. You weren't just sleeping, you were being gently crushed by the pelts of several apex predators. It's hard to have a nightmare about a wolf when you're literally wearing 6 of them to stay warm. But what if you had to, go in the middle of the night? You're all warm in your fur-covered wool tent and nature calls. You aren't walking down the hall to a bathroom with heated floors. No, you're reaching for the chamber pot. Or if you were really high status, you might use the garderobe. Now, the garderobe is one of my favorite bits of medieval irony. It was a tiny little room built into the thickness of the castle wall. It was essentially a hold that dropped straight down into the moat. But here's the kicker. They realized that the ammonia fumes rising up from the sewage pit actually killed the moths in their clothes. So they would hang their expensive silk robes and velvet tunics in the tiny room where they went to the bathroom. They called it a garderobe because it guarded the robes. So the most powerful people in Europe walked around smelling faintly of a stable, but hey, at least their clothes didn't have holes in them. Imagine stepping out of your warm bed, your feet hitting the freezing stone, and shuffling over to a hole that is literally venting freezing air directly onto your person. It was a quick process, very efficient. You didn't linger in the garderobe to read the news. You got back to your furs as fast as humanly possible. Then there was the fire. Of course, there was a fireplace, but medieval fireplaces were hilariously inefficient. They were huge, cavernous things. You could fit a whole tree trunk in there. But because they didn't really understand the physics of airflow yet, about 90% of the heat went straight up the chimney, and a good 10% of the smoke came straight into the room.
So you were warm if you were standing exactly 4 inches away from the flames, but your back would still be freezing, and you'd be coughing. It was a trade-off. Do you want to be warm and unable to breathe, or cold and well oxygenated? Most chose the smoke. It added to the ambiance, which is a nice way of saying everything in the castle smelled like a campfire that had been put out with damp socks. Let's float over to another royal disaster, because warmth wasn't just about furniture, it was about what you put inside your body. Before bed, you weren't drinking a chamomile tea, you were drinking posset. Posset was a hot drink made of milk curdled with wine or ale, often spiced with ginger or nutmeg. It sounds like something you'd find in the back of a ridge at a frat house, but back then it was medicine. The alcohol thinned the blood, or so they thought, and the heat of the drink helped raise your core temperature just enough to survive the trek from the fire to the bed. If you drank enough of it, you also didn't really care that the walls were weeping condensation. There's a certain kind of dignity in the way they failed to stay warm. They tried so hard. They had warming pans, these brass pans on long sticks filled with hot coals that a servant would slide between your sheets before you got in. It was like a medieval electric blanket, except with a non-zero chance of setting your mattress on fire and ending your dynasty in a very literal blaze of glory. But despite the furs, the posset, the warming pans, and the pile of servants on the floor, the primary way they stayed warm was simply by accepting that winter was a time of semi-hibernation. They didn't have winter blues because they didn't expect to be happy in February. They expected to be bored, slightly damp, and very, very close to their relatives. Which brings us to the social aspect of the medieval bedroom. Because the bedroom wasn't just for sleeping, it was the solar, the sunroom. It was where the lord and lady would hang out because it was the only room in the castle that wasn't a drafty nightmare. They'd have tapestries on the walls. Now, tapestries weren't just for decoration. They were the medieval version of pink fiberglass insulation. They created a layer of air between the damp stone and the living space. If you moved a tapestry in a castle in midwinter, you'd probably find a sheet of ice behind it. Those beautiful scenes of unicorns and hunting dogs were literally the only thing standing between a duchess and a very cold shoulder. Think about the life of someone like Charles VI of France, Charles the Mad. Here was a guy who already thought he was made of glass. Literally, he had a psychological condition where he feared he would shatter. Imagine being convinced you're a fragile piece of stemware and then living in a building that is basically a giant rock. He had to be wrapped in layers upon layers of reinforced clothing just to feel safe moving from his bed to his chair. For him, the cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a structural threat to his existence. And so they lived. They huddled. They wore hats to bed, big floppy velvet hats, because they knew that heat escapes through the head, even if they didn't know the science. They wore nightgowns that were basically thick wool robes. They were, in essence, sleeping in their clothes. When we look back at these grand ruins today, we see the majesty, but if you listen closely, you can almost hear the ghostly sound of 1,000 years of teeth chattering. It was a world of firelight and fur, of heavy curtains and the smell of wood smoke, where the greatest luxury in the world wasn't a gold crown or a fast horse.
The Tudor toaster and the terror of night air. So we've made it through the peak Middle Ages, but things didn't exactly get tropical as we moved into the Tudor era. If anything, the houses got bigger, the ceilings got higher, and the drafts just had more room to gain momentum. If you were living in Hampton Court during the reign of Henry VIII, you were living in one of the most sophisticated buildings in the world, which is a bit like saying you owned the world's most sophisticated cardboard box in the middle of a hurricane. Henry was a man who liked his comforts. He was a big guy, and big guys tend to run hot, but even he couldn't fight the physics of a British winter. By this point, the Great Hall was starting to go out of fashion for sleeping, and the Great Watching Chamber and Privy Chamber were in. This meant the king had a series of increasingly private, increasingly small rooms to retreat to. But small is a relative term when you're a Tudor monarch. These rooms were still large enough to park a small carriage in, and they were filled with the one thing Henry loved more than marriage certificates: windows. Huge, sprawling, leaded glass windows. At the time, they were called walls of light. In reality, they were walls of ice. Glass technology had improved, but it was still thin, and it rattled in the wind like a skeleton's teeth. The Royal Human Shield. Henry's bedtime routine was an absolute production. It wasn't just brush teeth and go. It was a military operation. To keep the king from freezing, he employed a literal army of servants whose entire job was to prep the bed. This was known as the making of the king's bed. First, a group of yeomen would enter the room and, I'm not making this up, take a wooden dagger and stab the straw mattress. They weren't looking for assassins, although that was a nice bonus. They were making sure there were no lumps or hidden discomforts. Then they'd lay down the canvas, the feather beds, and the sheets. But the real MVP of the Tudor bedroom was the groom of the stool. Now, this guy gets a lot of grief in history books because his job involved helping the king with his personal business. But he was also the king's most trusted confidant. And on a cold night, the groom and the other servants would often be responsible for warming the room. They would sit near the bed, keep the fire roaring until the king was actually under the covers, and then, and this is the cozy part, they would stay there. Henry slept in a bed of estate. It was a massive, towering structure that looked more like a cathedral than a piece of furniture. It had a heavy cellier, the roof of the bed, and testers, the back. When the curtains were pulled, it was airtight. Oh, as airtight as 16th century velvet can be. But there was a catch. The Tudors were absolutely terrified of night air. They believed that the air at night was physically different from the air during the day, that it was miasmatic, heavy with disease and dampness.
So while they were trying to stay warm, they were also trying to keep the air out. You had a king, potentially a queen, and maybe a few small dogs, all sealed inside a velvet box for 8 hours, breathing the same air over and over. By 4 a.m., that bed must have smelled like a locker room in a palace. The Great Bed of Ware. If you weren't the king, but you were still a somebody, you might find yourself at an inn sharing a bed like the famous Great Bed of Ware. This bed was legendary. It was over 10 feet wide. It was basically a wooden island. The rumor was that it could fit 12 people, and on a cold night, it did. Imagine being a traveler in the late 1500s. You're cold, your boots are soaked, and you pay for a spot in the great bed. You climb in, and you're sandwiched between a wool merchant from Leeds and a guy who claims to be a friar but smells mostly of fermented cabbage. Because why double down on blankets when you can double down on strangers? This was the human radiator theory of thermodynamics. You didn't worry about personal space. In the 16th century, personal space was a luxury for the dead. If you were alive, you were huddling. You'd all lie spoon style, and when one person wanted to turn over, they'd shout a command and everyone would flip at once. It was a synchronized dance of survival. The Sleepless Monarchs. Let's float over to the tragic personal life of Queen Elizabeth I. She was notoriously difficult to please when it came to her sleeping arrangements. She suffered from insomnia, likely because she was constantly worried about being assassinated or replaced by her cousin Mary. Elizabeth's bedrooms were filled with sweet herbs, lavender, rose petals, and meadowsweet, strewn across the floorboards. This wasn't just for the smell. When you walked on the herbs, they released oils that were supposed to calm the nerves and clarify the air. Imagine Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, pacing her room at 2 a.m. in a thick fur-lined nightgown, her red wig on a stand in the corner, her feet crunching on dried lavender. The fire is dying down to a dull orange glow. The shadows of the tapestries are moving in the draft. She's cold, she's tired, and she's surrounded by ladies-in-waiting who are all pretending to be asleep on their pallets so they don't have to listen to her vent about the King of Spain again. The Tudor solution to the cold was essentially more is more. More fabric, more people, more herbs, more alcohol. They had spiced ale and caudle, which was like a thick alcoholic eggnog. It didn't just warm you up, it knocked you out. And in a drafty stone room where the temperature was hovering around 40 degrees Fahrenheit, being unconscious was the best way to pass the time.
The midnight snack and the coal-fired chaos. So we've made it into the 17th century, and the world is getting a little more complicated. We've moved past the medieval huddle-for-dear-life phase and the Tudor velvet box phase, and we're entering a time when people started getting very creative with how they spent their nights. Because here's the thing, staying warm for 8 hours straight was almost impossible. Even with the best furs and the thickest curtains, the cold eventually wins. It seeps in, it finds the gaps. And this led to a very strange, very common habit that we've completely forgotten about today. It's what historians call segmented sleep, or the two sleeps. The intermission. If you were a Stuart-era noble, you didn't just go to bed at 10 p.m. and wake up at 6 a.m. That would have been weird. Instead, you'd go to bed around dusk. You'd huddle under your blankets, wait for the warming pan heat to fade, and sleep for about 4 hours. Then, around midnight or 1 a.m., you just wake up. But you didn't wake up because you were stressed about work or scrolling on a phone. You woke up because your body was cold and the first sleep had worn off. This was the watch. It was a 2-hour window where the whole of Europe was basically awake in the dark. And what did they do? Well, they did exactly what you'd expect a cold, bored person to do. They ate. They drank more of that spiced ale we talked about. They gossiped with the servants who were still snoring on the floor. Or, if they were feeling productive, they'd do a little reading by the light of a single flickering tallow candle. This was the time for deep thinking, mostly because it was too cold to move. You'd sit up in bed, wrapped in a night rail, which was essentially a heavy wool poncho, and you'd contemplate your sins or write a letter to a cousin about a land dispute. Then, after a couple of hours of being mildly productive and slightly less chilly, you'd drift off into your second sleep, which took you through to dawn. It was a rhythmic, slow way to live. The night wasn't a solid block of darkness, it was a story with an intermission. The rise of the coal monster. But as the 1600s rolled into the 1700s, the elites decided they were done with the two-sleep nonsense. They wanted constant, aggressive warmth, and that meant moving away from wood and toward coal. Now, coal was a game changer. It burned hotter and longer than wood. If you had a coal grate in your bedroom, you were living the dream. But coal had a dark side, literally. It was filthy. It produced a thick, yellow-black smoke that coated everything. If you were a royal during this transition, you had a choice. You could be cold, or you could wake up with your lungs feeling like they'd been lined with chimney soot. Most chose the soot. They started installing these elaborate coal stoves, often made of beautiful porcelain or cast iron. They were works of art, but they were also slightly terrifying. There's a story about the personal life of one minor German prince who was so obsessed with his new coal stove that he refused to let the servants dampen it down at night. He wanted his bedroom to feel like a tropical greenhouse. He ended up waking up in the middle of the night, hallucinating from carbon monoxide poisoning, convinced that the tapestries were coming to life and trying to eat his slippers. He wasn't mad, he was just very, very heavily medicated by his own heating system. The sickness of the night air, again. By this point, the fear of night air had reached a fever pitch. It wasn't just a superstition anymore, it was science. Doctors, and I use that term very loosely, were convinced that if you left a window open even a crack at night, you were essentially inviting the Grim Reaper in for a sleepover. This led to the nightcap becoming a mandatory piece of equipment. We see them in old cartoons, those long, pointy hats with the pom-pom on the end. They look ridiculous, but if you were a bald duke in 1720, that hat was your best friend. It kept your head from radiating your last bit of body heat into the cavernous, drafty room. And because they were so worried about the damp, they'd also wear bed socks made of thick, unwashed sheep's wool. These weren't the soft, fuzzy socks you get at Target. These were structural. They were stiff. They smelled like a wet farm. But when you combined the hat, the socks, the night rail, the 3 layers of blankets, and the coal smoke-filled air, you finally had it, a room that was actually genuinely warm. Of course, you were also probably slowly suffocating and definitely smelled like a burnt brisket. But hey, you weren't freezing to death, and in the 17th century, that was a massive win.
The Victorian Ice Age and the cult of the cold room. So, we've made it to the 1800s. You'd think that by the time we reached the era of steam engines and industrial progress, humanity would have finally figured out how to stay warm. But no, in a classic historical plot twist, the Victorians decided to pivot. They looked at the cozy, sealed-up, velvet-draped beds of their ancestors and decided that being warm was, well, a bit morally suspicious. Welcome to the era of the healthy chill. The great ventilation obsession. In the Victorian Rhine, stagnant air was the enemy. They became convinced that a warm bedroom was a breeding ground for effluvia and general wickedness. Doctors started writing manuals because Victorians loved nothing more than a manual telling them how to be miserable, suggesting that the ideal temperature for a bedroom was somewhere around barely above freezing. Florence Nightingale, the lady with the lamp herself, was a huge fan of this. She famously said that windows should be kept open at night, even in the dead of winter. If you were a Victorian child, your bedtime routine involved your mother tucking you in, kissing your forehead, and then opening the window wide enough to let in a stray owl and a light dusting of snow. The idea was that fresh air would harden the constitution. If you didn't wake up with a light layer of frost on your mustache, were you even trying to be healthy? It was a weird, masochistic era where being comfortable was seen as a sign of a weak character. If you were warm, you were probably a degenerate. If you were shivering, you were a patriot. The invention of the rubber savior. However, even the most stoic Victorian couldn't fight biology forever. They needed a workaround, something that would let them keep the room freezing but their bodies functional. Enter the hot water bottle. Before this, we had the brass warming pans filled with coals, which, as we discussed, were basically portable house fires. But in the mid-1800s, vulcanized rubber became a thing. Suddenly, you could have a soft, flexible bag filled with near-boiling water. This changed everything. It was the stealth warmth of the 19th century. You could pretend to be a rugged, cold-loving Victorian, but under the covers you were clutching a rubber bag like it was your only friend in the world. Of course, the early ones had a habit of leaking or smelling like a burning tire factory, but it was a small price to pay for not losing a toe to frostbite. The tragedy of the cold tub. Let's float over to the personal habits of the elite during this time. Imagine a young Victorian noble, let's call him Lord Percival. Percival wakes up in a room that is roughly 42 degrees. His breath is visible in the air. He's been sleeping under 6 layers of heavy wool blankets that weigh about 40 pounds. He climbs out of bed, his feet hitting a rug that feels like it's made of frozen needles. And what does he do? He takes a sponge bath with water that has been sitting in a porcelain pitcher all night. There's a good chance he has to crack a thin layer of ice on the surface of the water before he can wash his face. Because why double down on comfort when you can double down on discipline? They believed this invigorating start to the day was the secret to the British Empire's success. It wasn't the Navy, it was the fact that everyone was too cold to sit still, so they had to go out and conquer things just to stay warm. The iron bedstead revolution. This was also the era when the big wooden 4-poster room within a room finally died out, and the reason is a bit itchy. Victorians were obsessed with hygiene, and they realized that those beautiful carved wooden beds were basically luxury hotels for bedbugs. Wood is porous, it has nooks and crannies. Metal, however, is cold and inhospitable. So they switched to the iron bedstead. If you've ever seen a classic hospital-style metal bed, that's a Victorian invention. It was easy to clean, but it had 0 insulating properties. The air could circulate under it, over it, and through it. It was the final nail in the coffin for the cozy medieval microclimate. We traded the warmth of the wooden tent for the sterile, shivering safety of the iron frame. They were safer from bugs, sure, but they were now fully exposed to the Arctic drafts they were so proud of. It was a trade-off that only a Victorian could love, a choice between being bitten by insects or being slowly refrigerated in the name of science.
The steam-powered disaster and the pajama pivot. So we've arrived at the tail end of the 19th century and the dawn of the 20th. Science has progressed. We have electricity, mostly for light bulbs that flicker and hum. And we have the Industrial Revolution finally turning its gears toward the domestic sphere. The elites were tired of the healthy chill. They were done with cracking ice in their wash basins. They wanted what every human throughout history has truly desired, to be able to walk around their house without wearing 3 sheep and a bear. Enter the first attempts at central heating. If you were a wealthy aristocrat living in a sprawling country manor, you might decide to install a state-of-the-art steam heating system. On paper, it was a dream. Hot steam traveling through pipes into every room, no more coal soot, no more freezing toes. In reality, it was like living inside a giant temperamental pressure cooker. These early systems didn't have thermostats as we know them. They had 2 settings, Arctic tundra and the surface of the sun. You'd be lying in your iron bedstead, and suddenly the pipes would begin to knock. It wasn't a gentle sound. It was a rhythmic, metal-on-metal clanging that sounded like a poltergeist was trying to escape the plumbing. This was the steam expanding the pipes. Then the heat would hit. Within 20 minutes, your room would go from 45 degrees to 85 degrees. Because why double down on a fireplace when you can turn your bedroom into a literal sauna?
The air would become incredibly dry, your expensive wood paneling would start to warp and pop in the middle of the night, you'd wake up drenched in sweat, gasping for air, and forced to, wait for it, open the window, which of course let in the freezing winter air. It was a vicious cycle of sweating and shivering, managed by a boiler in the basement that looked like it was designed by a mad scientist. The Great Pajama Revolution. While the houses were trying and failing to regulate their temperature, what people wore to bed was undergoing a massive cultural shift. For centuries, everyone, men, women, and kings, wore nightgowns or nightshirts, basically long linen or wool dresses. But as the British Empire expanded into India, they discovered something life-changing: pajama. These were lightweight, loose-fitting trousers worn by the locals. The British looked at them and thought, wait, you mean I don't have to have a draft whistling around my ankles all night? By the late 1800s, pajamas became the ultimate modern flex for men. They were seen as masculine and colonial. But there was a catch. Early pajamas were often made of heavy silk or stiff flannel. If you were a high-ranking official, your pajamas might be so heavily starched and decorated with frogging and buttons that they were essentially a daytime suit you just happened to lie down in. Imagine a duke trying to relax in a pair of trousers so stiff they can practically stand up on their own. He's lying there, his steam pipes are clanging like a shipyard, his room is 90 degrees, and he's wearing a starched silk collar to bed because standards must be maintained. It was a transition period where the technology of comfort was evolving faster than the human ability to actually relax. The early electric blanket and its hazards. As we nudge into the early 1900s, we see the first electric bed warmers. Now we think of electric blankets as cozy. These early versions were, well, they were exciting. They were essentially large heating pads wrapped in fabric, often with exposed wiring that would be a crime by any modern safety board. There was always a lingering smell of singed wool in the air. People were so desperate to avoid the cold that they were willing to sleep on a device that had a roughly 5% chance of spontaneously combusting if you rolled over too quickly. But for the first time in history, the cold was being pushed back into the corners. The night air was no longer a ghost to be feared, but a nuisance to be managed. The great stone castles were being fitted with radiators, the tapestries were being replaced by wallpaper, and the four-poter beds were being chopped up for firewood or sent to museums. We were moving toward the modern world, a world of constant, boring 70-degree warmth. We lost the drama of the two sleeps and the community of the human radiator bed sharing. We gained the ability to sleep in a t-shirt in January, which is great for our toes, but perhaps a little less interesting for our stories.
The 20th century chill and the final frontier of the pillow. So here we are, entering the 1900s. We've survived the freezing moats of the Middle Ages, the lead-glass drafts of the Tudors, and the soot-heavy coal stoves of the Georgians. You'd think the 20th century would be the happily ever after for sleep. But of course, the human race, especially the upper class, is never quite satisfied with just being comfortable. The sleeping porch craze. Before air conditioning and modern insulation became the standard, we had one last weird detour in the quest for the perfect night: the sleeping porch. Around the 1910s and 20s, the fresh air obsession from the Victorian era didn't just stay in the bedroom, it moved outside. Wealthy families began building screened-in porches specifically for sleeping. The idea was that sleeping in the raw night air, which was now considered a miracle cure for tuberculosis rather than a death sentence, would make you more vigorous. Imagine being a 1920s socialite. You've spent the evening dancing the Charleston and drinking gin. You're exhausted. But instead of going to a cozy room, you go to a porch. It's November in New York. You climb into a bed that is essentially outdoors, wrapped in so many blankets you look like a human burrito, while the wind howls through the screens.
It was the ultimate wealthy person flex. I am so rich I can afford to sleep like a pioneer, but on a silk mattress. The evolution of the pillow, from stone to sponge. While we've been talking about the rooms, we haven't talked about where the head goes. And the history of the pillow is, quite frankly, a nightmare. In ancient times, particularly in Egypt and China, pillows were often made of stone, wood, or ceramic. They were U-shaped cradles designed to keep your head off the ground, and more importantly, to keep your elaborate hairstyle from being crushed. Comfort was a distant second to not having to spend 4 hours on your hair tomorrow morning. By the time we get to our medieval and Tudor royals, pillows had become bolsters, long, heavy sacks stuffed with straw, or, if you were fancy, horsehair. They were firm. If you hit someone with a medieval pillow, you wouldn't start a pillow fight, you'd start a lawsuit. But in the 20th century, we saw the rise of the down pillow as a mass-market luxury. But even then, people were picky. King Edward VII, for instance, was notoriously obsessive about his pillows. He required a specific arrangement of wedges to keep him propped up, partly because he was a heavy smoker and needed to keep his airways open, and partly because he just liked the feeling of being a semi-vertical monarch even in his sleep. The modern thermostat, the end of history. And then it happened, the thermostat. With the widespread adoption of central heating and cooling, the war against the draft was finally won. For the first time in human history, the temperature of the room was no longer a matter of fate, furs, or how many servants you could fit on the floor. It was a dial. We lost something in that transition. We lost the 2 sleeps. We lost the communal warmth of the great bed of ware. We lost the smell of wood smoke and the rhythmic clicking of cooling stone. Today, we sleep in rooms that are perfectly regulated, perfectly silent, and, if we're being honest, a little bit boring. We don't have to worry about freezing to death in our sleep. We don't have to drink curdled ale to thin our blood. We just pull up a duvet, maybe turn on a white noise machine that mimics the sound of a wind we no longer have to feel, and we drift off. Final thoughts for the weary. As you lie there tonight, feeling the warmth of your modern blankets and the stillness of your insulated walls, just take a second to appreciate your toes. Think of the 14th century Duke shivering under a pile of dead wolves. Think of Queen Elizabeth I pacing on her lavender-scented floorboards. Think of the Victorian child waking up with frost on their blankets. You are living the dream that every king and queen in history would have traded their crown for. A night of sleep where the only thing you have to worry about is the dream itself. The lights are low, the stone walls are gone, the drafts are silenced. Sleep well. You've earned it.
The Versailles Paradox, Golden Walls and Frozen Toilets. Wait, did we skip part 7? Honestly, in the grand, hazy timeline of history, does it even matter? When you're living in a palace that's more theatrical set than actual house, time tends to blur together anyway. And if we're talking about the pinnacle of royal discomfort, the absolute gold standard of being miserable but looking great while doing it, we have to talk about the Sun King, Louis XIV, and his little weekend project, Versailles. The world's largest icebox. Louis XIV wanted to show the world that he had complete control over nature. He moved thousands of tons of earth, redirected rivers for his fountains, and built a palace so large you could practically see the curvature of the earth from one end of the hallway to the other. But there was one thing the Sun King couldn't control: the laws of thermodynamics. Versailles was, and still is, an architectural nightmare for anyone who likes their blood to remain in a liquid state during January. The ceilings were high enough to house a small fleet of hot air balloons. The windows were massive, and the material of choice? Marble. Everywhere. Marble floors, marble walls, marble columns. If you remember what we said about stone hoarding the cold, Marble is the overachiever of the family. It feels like stepping on a slab of solid nitrogen. During the Great Winter of 1709, the cold was so intense at Versailles that the wine literally froze in the king's glass on the dinner table. Imagine being the most powerful man in Europe, sitting under a gold leaf ceiling wearing a wig that costs more than a village, and you can't even have a drink because your burgundy has turned into a popsicle. Because why double down on central heating when you can just have more gold leaf? The Hall of Mirrors and Drafts. Then there's the Hall of Mirrors. It's iconic, right? 357 mirrors reflecting the gardens. But in the winter, that hall was essentially a wind tunnel. The mirrors weren't just for vanity, they were supposed to reflect the light and, theoretically, the heat from the candles. It didn't work. Courtiers would have to walk through that hall to see the king, dressed in silk and lace, fabrics that have the insulation power of a wet paper towel. They would be shivering so violently that their diamonds would rattle. They'd have to wear multiple pairs of silk stockings and hide small muffs, those fuzzy hand warmers, inside their sleeves. Some of the ladies even had foot warmers hidden under their massive hoop skirts, little metal boxes filled with hot coals that they'd carry around like a secret burning pet. It was a high-stakes game of don't set the silk on fire while trying not to die of hypothermia. The scent of majesty. Let's float over to the personal hygiene aspect, because if you're too cold to move, you're definitely too cold to wash. At Versailles, bathing was considered a bit of a health risk. They believed water opened the pores to the plague or evil humors. Instead, they practiced dry washing. They would take a piece of lemon, maybe dip it in a little alcohol or rose water, and just rub the visible parts. The result? A palace that smelled like a mix of very expensive jasmine perfume, old sweat, and the 10,000 horses living in the stables next door. And because it was too cold to walk to the latrines, which were basically just holes in the floor in far-off corners of the palace, people just didn't. They'd use a chaise percée, a chair with a hole in it behind a screen in the corner of a room. Or if they were feeling particularly lazy and the hallways were long, they just used the space under the stairs. Imagine the scene. You're at a grand ball. The music is playing. The mirrors are sparkling. But the floor is freezing, the wine is frozen, and there's a distinct lingering scent of unwashed aristocrat hanging in the air like a heavy fog. It was the most glamorous dumpster fire in history. The King's Bedtime Show. Even at Versailles, the bed remained the only safe haven. Louis XIV's bedtime was a public event known as the coucher. Dozens of people would crowd into his bedroom to watch him take off his shoes and put on his nightcap. His bed was a massive velvet-draped fortress, but even with the curtains closed, he often complained of the chill. He had warming men who would literally lie in his bed for an hour before he got in just to preheat the sheets with their own body warmth. Being a royal bed warmer was an actual job. You'd spend your professional life being a human heating pad for a guy who thought he was a literal star. But as the candles were snuffed out and the courtiers filed out, leaving the king alone in his velvet box, the reality of Versailles set in. The wind would whistle through the gaps in the marble, the shadows would dance on the tapestries, and the Sun King would huddle under 5 layers of fur, waiting for the sun to actually come up and do its job. The lesson of Versailles is simple. You can own the world, you can build a palace of glass and gold, and you can command the rivers to flow backward. But at 3 a.m. in January, you're still just a shivering human looking for a warm spot on the mattress.
The Roman Hypocaust and the Great Regression. You know, we should probably talk about the sheer audacity of the Romans, because if we're looking at a timeline of human comfort, the middle of the story is actually much colder than the beginning. While the medieval knights were huddling in their stone freezers and the Tudors were stabbing their mattresses with wooden daggers, they were all living in the shadow of a civilization that had actually figured this out 1,000 years earlier. The Romans looked at a cold floor and said, "Absolutely not." The floor is lava, almost.
If you were a Roman elite living in a villa in Roman Britain, somewhere like Bath or York, you weren't shivering. You were probably walking around indoors in a thin linen tunic and sandals, feeling quite smug. This was thanks to the hypocaust. Instead of trying to heat the air, which is flighty and annoying, the Romans heated the structure itself. They built their houses on top of stacks of bricks called pillae, creating a crawl space underneath the floor. Then they light a massive furnace outside and funnel the hot air and smoke through that space and up through hollow tiles in the walls. Essentially, the entire house was a radiator. The floors were so warm that sometimes the servants had to wear special wooden-soled shoes just to avoid burning their feet. It was the ultimate underfloor heating flex. But then the empire collapsed, the knowledge was lost, and for the next millennium, Europeans went back to living in damp caves and pretending that night air was a demon. It's one of the great "why did we double down on stupidity" moments in human history. The sad, sickly, and spoiled. Royal nurseries. If staying warm was hard for a grown king, it was a Herculean task for a royal infant. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the mortality rate for children was terrifying, even for royals, and their sleeping habits didn't help. They believed in swaddling, wrapping a baby so tightly in linen bandages that it couldn't move a limb. The theory was that it would keep their limbs straight and prevent them from growing crooked. In reality, it just made it impossible for the poor kid to generate any heat through movement. Imagine a little prince wrapped up like a tiny lace-covered mummy, placed in a wooden cradle that's being rocked by a nurse who's probably half asleep and shivering herself. Because they were so worried about the drafts, they'd often place the cradle right next to the fire. But as we know, medieval and Renaissance fires were temperamental. One minute, the baby is being slow roasted, and the next, the fire dies down and the temperature drops to 40 degrees. This constant thermal whiplash is part of why so many royal lines were plagued by sickly heirs. They weren't just inbred, though let's be honest, that was a huge part of it. They were also just chronically cold and then suddenly overheated. The great cuddle of the peasantry. Before we wrap up this long, sleepy monologue, we should acknowledge that the peasants might have actually had it better than the kings in one specific way. While the king was lonely in his massive, drafty bed of estate, the common people were practicing the great cuddle. In a small cottage, you didn't have room for a dozen bedrooms. You had one room. And in that room, you had the family, the grandparents, the kids, and, on particularly cold nights, the livestock. There is a very real, very biological warmth that comes from a cow sleeping 3 feet away from you. A cow is essentially a 1,200-pound furnace that runs on grass. If you were a medieval peasant, sleeping in a loft above your animals was the height of luxury. The heat would rise, the family would huddle together under a single giant wool felt, and they'd stay toasty all night. The king had gold, but the peasant had a cow and a cuddle. And on a Tuesday in January, I think we all know who is getting the better night's sleep. Closing the great book of bedtime. We've covered a lot of ground tonight. From the stone-cold keeps of the Normans to the steam pipe symphonies of the Victorians, and finally back to the heated floors of the Romans. History is often told through battles and treaties, but the real history of humanity is told in the quiet hours. It's the history of people trying to find a little bit of comfort in a world that was often dark, loud, and very, very cold. The furnace is hummed. The thermostat is set. Your pillows are soft and definitely not made of stone. The world outside is 2025, and the night air is just air. You can let go now. The drafts are gone. The story is over. Good night.
Well, look at you, still awake.
Or maybe you're just hovering in that strange velvet-lined space between consciousness and dreams, where the sound of my voice feels more like a memory than a monologue. It's funny, isn't it? We spent all this time traveling through centuries of shivering royals and frozen wine, only to end up right here, in your room, in the present, surrounded by things that a medieval king would have considered literal witchcraft. But before we finally pull the heavy velvet curtains on this story, let's talk about the irony of our modern comfort. Because even now, with our smart thermostats and our memory foam, we're still just those same fragile humans trying to trick our brains into feeling safe enough to close our eyes. The white noise ancestry. Have you ever wondered why so many people today need a fan blowing or a white noise machine playing the sound of rain on a tin roof just to fall asleep? We tell ourselves it's to drown out the city or the neighbor's dog, but if we look back through our long, cold history, there's a deeper reason. For thousands of years, sleep was never silent. If you were in a castle, there was the constant crackle of the hearth and the rustle of straw. If you were in a Tudor manor, there was the whistling of the wind through the leaded glass. If you were a peasant, there was the rhythmic breathing of your cow. Silence in the ancient world was actually terrifying. Silence meant the fire had gone out. Silence meant the guards had fallen asleep, or the predators were stalking. We find comfort in these electronic hums today because they are the digital ghosts of the fires and the livestock that kept our ancestors alive. We aren't listening to rain on a tin roof. We're listening for the reassurance that the world hasn't gone cold. The memory foam and the stone pillow. And then there's the bed itself. We've moved from stone cradles to straw mattresses, to goose down, to iron frames, and now to NASA-engineered memory foam. We spend thousands of dollars on mattresses that promise to align our spines and cradle our pressure points. But go back and look at the half-baked Habsburg potato or any of the other royals we've discussed. They didn't have lumbar support. They slept propped up on a pile of bolsters, almost sitting upright, because they were terrified that if they laid flat, their humors would shift and they'd choke in their sleep. They were supported by nothing but fear and a lot of expensive pillows. We live in a world where the physical struggle of sleep has been solved, but the mental struggle is just as loud. Louis XIV worried about assassins. We worry about that weird thing we said to a coworker 3 years ago. The cold has moved from the walls of the castle into the corridors of our minds. The final drift. As we finally reach the end of this 1.5-hour journey, I want you to take a long, slow breath. Feel the weight of your blankets. They aren't wolf pelts and they aren't damp wool. They are light, they are clean, and they are yours. Think about the sheer, incredible luxury of your own privacy. You don't have a groom of the stool waiting by your door. You don't have 6 teenagers named Piers snoring on your floor. You are in your own fortress, and the night air is nothing more than a breeze. The history of how we slept is the story of how we survived. We huddled, we shivered, we drank curdled ale, and we built wooden tents. We fought the cold with everything we had, and tonight you are the winner of that 1,000-year war. The fire is out, but the room is warm. The mirrors are dark, but the air is clear. The history is over, and the rest is yours. Go ahead. Let the words drift away. Let the stone walls dissolve. Good night. Truly, good night.
Well, look at you, still awake. Or maybe you're just hovering in that strange velvet-lined space between consciousness and dreams, where the sound of my voice feels more like a memory than a monologue. It's funny, isn't it? We spent all this time traveling through centuries of shivering royals and frozen wine, only to end up right here, in your room, in the present, surrounded by things that a medieval king would have considered literal witchcraft.
But before we finally pull the heavy velvet curtains on this story, let's talk about the irony of our modern comfort. Because even now, with our smart thermostats and our memory foam, we're still just those same fragile humans trying to trick our brains into feeling safe enough to close our eyes. The white noise ancestry. Have you ever wondered why so many people today need a fan blowing or a white noise machine playing the sound of rain on a tin roof just to fall asleep? We tell ourselves it's to drown out the city or the neighbor's dog, but if we look back through our long, cold history, there's a deeper reason. For thousands of years, sleep was never silent. If you were in a castle, there was the constant crackle of the hearth and the rustle of straw. If you were in a Tudor manor, there was the whistling of the wind through the leaded glass. If you were a peasant, there was the rhythmic breathing of your cow. Silence in the ancient world was actually terrifying. Silence meant the fire had gone out. Silence meant the guards had fallen asleep, or the predators were stalking. We find comfort in these electronic hums today because they are the digital ghosts of the fires and the livestock that kept our ancestors alive. We aren't listening to rain on a tin roof. We're listening for the reassurance that the world hasn't gone cold. The memory foam and the stone pillow. And then there's the bed itself. We've moved from stone cradles to straw mattresses to goose down to iron frames and now to NASA-engineered memory foam. We spend thousands of dollars on mattresses that promise to align our spines and cradle our pressure points. But go back and look at the half-baked Habsburg potato or any of the other royals we've discussed. They didn't have lumbar support. They slept propped up on a pile of bolsters, almost sitting upright, because they were terrified that if they laid flat, their humors would shift and they'd choke in their sleep. They were supported by nothing but fear and a lot of expensive pillows. We live in a world where the physical struggle of sleep has been solved, but the mental struggle is just as loud. Louis XIV worried about assassins. We worry about that weird thing we said to a coworker 3 years ago. The cold has moved from the walls of the castle into the corridors of our minds. The final drift. As we finally reach the end of this 1.5-hour journey, I want you to take a long, slow breath. Feel the weight of your blankets. They aren't wolf pelts and they aren't damp wool. They are light, they are clean, and they are yours. Think about the sheer, incredible luxury of your own privacy. You don't have a groom of the stool waiting by your door. You don't have 6 teenagers named Piers snoring on your floor. You are in your own fortress, and the night air is nothing more than a breeze. The history of how we slept is the story of how we survived. We huddled, we shivered, we drank curdled ale, and we built wooden tents. We fought the cold with everything we had, and tonight you are the winner of that 1,000-year war. The fire is out, but the room is warm. The mirrors are dark, but the air is clear. The history is over, and the rest is yours. Go ahead. Let the words drift away. Let the stone walls dissolve. Good night. Truly, good night.